Frank Yerby's Judas, My Brother. Chapter 8. 1 year from that day, I was sitting on a rock outside the monastery at Qumran, looking down at the blinding silver blue of Lake Asphaltides, as the Romans, who always put fact before poetry, called the Dead Sea. I was dressed in the white robes of an Essene novice. I carried the little hoe of personal hygiene at my belt. But I would never become an Essene. I knew that now. For some weeks after my father and Yosef ha-Arimathea had brought me to Qumran, I lay silent and remote on my bed of pain. But summer, being upon the land, the Essenes bore my litter outside, and left me under the vast canopy of the sky. Lying there night after night, some of them moon-silvered and ghostly, so that the lake was a misting, a loveliness, the others blacker than the pit, blazing with stars. I could feel the whole ponderous, slow turning of the universe above me, so that my heart cried out with the psalmists. When I consider the heavens, the work of thy fathers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained, what is man, and thou art mindful of him? And the Son of Man, that thou visitest him? Then I whispered to myself, that is, if you ever do, and bent my head and wept. But that very next morning I was stronger, and felt something like hunger stirring in me. Thereafter, very slowly, I began to heal. I must admit that my progress was not steady. I fall back often enough into grief, into near madness, into ravings, and again my bowels were torn. I composed for myself, from the words of the psalmist, a whole new litany of pain, by taking the verses out of context and combining them to suit myself. My soul is also sore vexed, but thou, O Lord, how long? I am weary with my groaning. All the night I make my bed to swim. I water my couch with my tears. Why standest thou afar off, O Lord? Why hidest thou thyself in times of trouble? How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord, forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long shall mine enemy be exalted over me? The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me, from the words of my roaring? O my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not, and the night season, and thou art silent. But life was in me stubborn and deep. The sun came up for me ceaselessly in the morning over the bleak mountains, sank down at night beyond the bitter lake. My bones knitted themselves together. The sparse and simple foods the Essenes gave me stayed down. I rose up from bed at last and walked. Even after I was strong enough to have gone home, I elected to stay. At first, I worked as a domestic servant, for among the Essenes the humblest tasks are accorded honor. I cleaned the communal rooms and kitchens, swept the plaster floors, raked those of hard-beaten earth. Later I worked in the pottery, turning the vases they used to store the sacred scriptures in. But the heat of the kilns sickened me for the same reason. I was spared taking turns as a kitchen scullion. But outdoors, I made myself useful, and by so doing acquired a certain skill that subsequently was to affect my life in no small measure. At that time, the members of the Qumran community were building a new aqueduct, as well as repairing the old one, for nothing was more important to the bathers at dawn than water. Yet they could not have chosen a worse place for their refuge in that particular regard for the closest available supply of abundant water was the Dead Sea, which, as all the world knows, is so salt, and not even fish can live in it, and so dense that nothing, not even a man bound hand and foot, will sink when therein thrown. Therefore, they had to bring a steady supply of the fluid without which we cannot live, from sources high in the rugged hills beyond the monastery. For by then their numbers had grown too great to make total dependence upon the great cisterns they built to catch the winter rains possible any longer. Now, ever since my days in Rome, aqueducts had fascinated me. How many hours I had walked beside the Marcian and the Appian arches with Helvetia, studying their graceful sweep and soar. You have to be a Judean, a dweller in that parched land, baked from childhood by its pitiless sun, to understand how deep that fascination was. Even in well-watered Galilee, upon more than one occasion, I had seen my uncle Hezron lose his entire harvest because the rains didn't come or delayed too long. So I asked to be assigned to working on the new aqueduct, which of course was much harder work than repairing the old, because I knew I'd learn far more about the art of building them that way. I made a fearful nuisance of myself with my questions. What stones were best to build the arches with? Wouldn't bricks do if stones weren't available? What materials were best for lining the miniature-covered canal that carried the water atop the arches? How did one maintain enough pitch over so many stadia to keep the water flowing? It was that last question that was all important, for it was upon it that the functioning of an aqueduct depends. The correct answer, the Pequod in charge told me, was 6 unciae. An unciae being about the length of the second joint of your little finger, in case you don't know, of fall in every 100 feet of length. But there were other problems, chief among them being a source of enough fresh water in the first place, for the Essenes, with all their ritual bathing and ceremonial uses of the precious liquid, needed, and I'm being conservative in my estimate, at least 10 times as much water per man as did the citizens of Jerusalem, say. They'd solve that problem handily enough by finding a natural basin high in the hills and damming up the lower end of it so that the water pouring into it from the winter rains couldn't run off. Thus they had made a quite respectable artificial lake whose waters, brought down to Khirbet Qumran by the old aqueduct, filled the local cisterns sufficiently to serve their needs all year round. But by the time I was brought to them, not even that supply sufficed, and they'd been forced to build another artificial lake. This second lake was considerably higher, and some distance away from the old one, so that the new aqueduct had to come down to the monastery by a long curving roundabout sweep. Which was why I got a chance to work on it, despite the fact that they started it more than 2 years before my arrival at Qumran. You see, they'd run into problems so grave that I was up and about again by the time the new structure was 3/4 done. First of all, they had to cut a tunnel through solid rock with hammers and chisels to draw the water from their new lake once the rains had formed it. And now they were hopelessly halted on the edge of a gorge whose further side, that is, the side nearer to the monastery, was higher than that one they had reached with the aqueduct on its descent from their man-made lake. Not much higher, say a rod. But that rod represented catastrophe, because it meant not only that they couldn't maintain the needed drop of 6 inches every 100 feet, but that they had to, for a distance of some 5 or 6 rods, slant the bed of the little watercourse atop their arches up to an angle so steep that it was inconceivable that the water would continue to flow. They organized 3 nights of fasting and prayer, asking God to inspire someone with a solution to that quite insoluble problem. Do you know whom God chose to illuminate? Me. Don't smile. I'd learned a great deal about hydraulic engineering by then. The Pequod in charge of the works was indulgent, and that he was almost assuredly more than a little flattered by my interest wasn't strange when you consider the fact that all the rest worked in stony silence, or to the accompaniment of groans designed to demonstrate how great their sufferings were. In any event, he taught me all he knew of the art, which was considerable, but actually I was the only one at Qumran who could have solved the problem, because I was the sole man there who had been to Rome. To tell the unflattering truth, and to place my glorious accomplishment on its proper level in the scale of things, all I had to do was to use my memory, recall how the Romans, the finest practical engineers the world had ever seen, solved the same problem when they met it along the routes of the colossal spans they built to bring water from sources 30 milia and more away to Rome. Because you see, they had met this self-same problem, that by forcing water to run uphill against the whole awful downpull of the world, and solved it. God's illumination was far from brilliant, or perhaps more justly, I should admit the material he had to work upon. The sodden lump inside my skull was exceptionally poor. Be that as it may, it still took me 3 whole nights of cudgeling my so-called brains before I finally remembered how the first inverted siphon, the device the Romans had invented to make water run uphill, I'd ever seen looked, not to mention the detailed explanation I'd had of its workings from a Roman engineer who was a friend of my adoptive father, Quintus Valerius Caius. And, like all poor Caius's friends, one of Lydia's former lovers, surely. I went to the Pequod and drew the device on the ground for him with a pointed stick. Draw it for yourself, or else you have no clear idea how it works. First scribe a horizontal line, perfectly straight and level. Now leave a gap, then draw another horizontal line beyond the gap, a little higher than the other. Connect the 2 lines with a capital letter U, so that the end of one line and the beginning of the other touch the tops of the U. Naturally, you'll have to make one side of the U a little higher than the other to meet the elevation of the second line. The Pequod stared at my drawing, shook his head. "'Tis against all the laws of nature," said he, "but I wouldn't give up. I built him a model of bricks, making the channel atop my miniature aqueduct of clay. I duplicated the terrain to scale, gorge and all. The arches that span my little gorge, instead of maintaining as near a level as possible, I made considerably lower than those on either side, thus forming the capital U you've drawn, so that the water coming from above roared down into the deep slanted, low-slung half-loop with such force that it pushed itself uphill on the other side. He watched me pour water into the lower side of the device, saw that water race down the U-shaped reversed arch I had made, and up the other, higher side 100 times before he believed it. Then, very simply, he said, "So be it, my son. God has illuminated your heart." The inverted siphon was built under my personal supervision. The Packwood stood aside, told even members of the elect to obey my orders. The lesson in humility he gave me by the quiet serenity with which he, immensely my superior, in every way that counted, took orders from me, a lowly novice, served me well. When my task was done, and the inverted siphon worked perfectly upon being tested, I quietly took my place in the ranks without a single boast. Thereafter, the Packwood made me his chief assistant. The last 3 stadia of the aqueduct were built as much under my direction as under his. I worked harder than any man there, studying the smallest details of the building process. You see, my interest was far from idle. I meant to free my Uncle Hezron's farm, surely to be mine one day, from its agonizing dependence upon the seasonal rains. The aqueduct done, my day of glory ended, I turned without complaint to far lesser tasks. I plugged cracks in the cisterns with clay, cleansed them when empty, used them with the other novices, apart, of course, from the Esath ha-Yahad, the elect, for my daily ritual washings. I repaired roofs. I served as goatherd and shepherd. I worked as a common farm laborer in the green fields at Ein Freshka. My skin burned black, my muscles corded into sinewy powder. I did without protest, with peace, with joy, things that no high-born Sadducee would have dreamed of demeaning himself to do, and was, by doing them, in a strange way, healed. But one day, hearing that one of the Mashkil, the teaching masters, was going up to Jerusalem, I went into the scriptorium and begged a scrap of parchment, a quill, and some ink, in order to write my mother a letter, and my position among the novices changed vastly for the better. The Packwood in charge of the scriptorium was surprised only by my boldness. Writing is no rare accomplishment among my people. Even such sons of humble folk as Yeshua's managed not infrequently to learn to scribble a word or two. On that occasion, however, a thought struck the Packwood. He pointed to a bench before the stone writing tables, said to me, "Sit down, son Nathan, and show me a sample of your penmanship. We always have need here of a clear hand." I did as I was told. Despite a lingering stiffness from the but recently knit bones of the arm the Numidian had broken, my hand had lost little of its cunning, its skill. The Packwood examined the biblical verse I copied out. Then he said, "You write well, Nathan. Go ahead with your missive to your mother. Meantime, I'll ask the Mabagar to assign you to me permanently. As a novice, of course, I wasn't allowed to copy any of the more secret scrolls. For the most part, I copied the sacred scriptures, common to all Jews. But some of the cryptic writing also passed through my hands because the Packwood saw that I could copy it accurately, though I didn't understand it at all. Had he dreamed I would come to decipher it, he would never have let me so much as glance at it. But there, in the scriptorium, among the soft whispering of the goose quills, I found an interest that put back some savor in my existence, to puzzle my head day-long, night-long, over the meaning of the secret books. I soon saw that they had some connection with predicting the future, an art for which throughout Israel the Bereth Hadashahim, the New Covenanters, as Essenes called themselves, were famed. At last I connected these writings with the Essenes' practice of placing certain elders upon the watchtowers, where they studied the movements of the heavenly bodies and recorded them on charts, using the signs of the zodiac. As soon as I came to understand this essential aspect of the question, it was child's play for me to break the code. As soon as I was sure I had the method right, I tried casting a horoscope for myself. It said I would love a dark woman hopelessly through many moons, that nothing would ever come of this love, that therefore I would marry another and by her have sons. Moreover, I would become involved in great and murky events, become a member of a new body of emergent saints, at which point I threw the bloody nonsense into the fire. But my peaceful life with the Essenes soon came quite unexpectedly to an end. I remember it was a winter day and blisteringly hot, for in that lowest spot on earth the seasons were indistinguishable from one another. Quite often at Qumran the months of Shabat and Adar are hotter than Ab and Elul. Moreover, it was shortly before or shortly after the anniversary of the day my broken carcass had been brought on a litter to the monastery. I sat there on a rock before the door of the novices' eating hall, and stared downward toward the harsh metallic glare of the Dead Sea. And I'm sure it was not more briny nor more bitter than was my heart. You see, I hadn't found there what I'd hoped to, which was the serene and lofty peace of mind that the Essenes possessed. After one full year among them, all I had was an unsatisfied hunger after the peace of theirs, that tranquility. I'd struggled, mortified my flesh, submitted zealously to discipline in an effort to find again my childhood faith in a just and beneficent God, but neither my personal history nor that of my people would allow me that comfort. All that had happened to my race inclined me to think that if they were God's chosen people, it was far better to be forgot by him. And if what he had let happen to me was in punishment for my sins, he couldn't be called merciful. And if he'd used my poor, sinless, chaste, pure, good, kind, tender, loving Helvy as his instrument of my chastisement, the mildest term I could apply to him was monster. Therefore, I was forced to the conclusion that it was less repugnant, morally, not to believe in God at all than it was to worship an absentee landlord of a deity on the one hand, and that granting him the benefit of every conceivable doubt, or Satan's own fiendish twin on the other. Naturally, I wasn't fool enough to inflict these bitter and rebellious opinions of mine upon the Essenes, but seeing that I made no progress at all toward their peculiar and evident sanctity, they preached at and questioned me endlessly until they proved me into an exposition of my thought, to wit, that logically speaking, and my Father knows on the first day of the week that on the third I am going to bed with a tavern slut, get her with an unlawful child, kill a man in a drunken quarrel over an unwashed favors, be strangled in due course by the authorities for my crime. If I repeat, my Father knows all this beforehand and does not chain me to my bed on the morning of the third. He is guilty of unspeakable cruelty, which I pointed out to them is exactly the behavior of which they piously accuse their God. That logically speaking, if you grant man freedom of will in order to load him like a poor braying ass with the responsibility for his sins, you hurl God down from heaven, because man can only be free to act against the will of God if God has neither knowledge nor power. For a God without omniscience and omnipotence may be whatever else you will, but certainly not a god. That, logically speaking, God can never absolve himself totally of complicity in mankind's evil-doing. For does not the created partake inevitably of the nature of the Creator? Is not cause, even first cause, God, eternally, if invisibly present in result, even final result, man? Or to put it in a more mundane fashion, would I have been a doubter had I been Uncle Hezron's son? Can my father, with a clear conscience, punish me for sins which are but reflections of the tendencies I got from him? Whoremonger, brawler, drunkard, skeptic that I am, who made me thus? And if you answer, Satanus, I reply, why not then worship him, since he so endlessly and effortlessly demonstrates that his power is greater than your God's? That, logically speaking, that is precisely what your beliefs leads you to. For if you insist upon retaining all three concepts, man's freedom and God's total knowledge and limitless power, then you must dethrone Yahweh and put Black Samuel, Satanus, in his place. For a deity that can act and won't, that knows beforehand and neither warns nor stays, and then metes out a punishment so awful that no sin any man could do is commensurate with it. For what again, for what iniquity can equal Sheol's endless night, Gehenna's eternal fire, is evil's pristine self? Thereupon they dolefully shook their heads at me and came back with the religious man's stock irreverency, that the ways of God are too lofty, too mysterious for our puny human intellects, and we must worship and adore him without questioning, humbly bend our necks to his rod, kiss the awful hand that sends the pain, which teaches us wisdom. That, and all the time I was seeing that thing that had been by my Helvey in that tub, until I couldn't even bear the sound of their voices anymore, and walked off and left them there. So now I knew I could never be one of them because I lacked the beautiful simplicity of their minds. They believed all things already explained. I knew in bitter bones that nothing was. All I was hoping now was that they'd give up and leave me in peace, and I knew they wouldn't do that either. They had set their hearts upon bringing me into the fold. I wrote a beautiful hand. I was the son of a Sadducee priest, and though they denounced pride, it lingered in them still. To gain such a one as I would have gladdened them. I was thinking all that when I heard footsteps, and turning, saw a great number of them coming toward me. At their head strode no less than the Mabakar himself, accompanied by the stern-faced Pakid, followed by the Meles and Doresh HaTorah, and my personal Mashgil, by whom I mean the teaching master who had been assigned to me. They came up to me and stood there staring at me in solemn anger. "Son Nathan," the Macabre said, "what is this I hear of you?" I prostrated myself before him with no feeling of resentment. In fact, I felt the utmost reverence for so holy a man. "Get up," the Mabakar said. "Now speak out. Is it true that you're guilty of blasphemy." "I, Father?" I said, astonished. "You! Did you not say that your maskil, that the hymns were nonsense?" I stared at my master. This was difficult. I had made no such sweeping statement. What I had said was what I decided to repeat to the Macabre now. "Yes, Father, and no. Some are, some aren't." The whole Yehad gasped, but the Macabre went on looking at me with total serenity. "Go on," he said. "Some are true," I said softly. "Take, for instance, I was one forsaken in the desert without refuge, and all that I planted turned into wormwood. My pain was terrible. There was no stopping it. My soul was overwhelmed. Go down to Sheol, and my spirit descended among the dead. My life had reached the deepest pit. Without rest by day, by night, my soul grew faint. My bones blazed with hidden fire, and the flames of it devoured me, exhausted my strength, consuming my flesh. My arm was broken at the shoulder. I could not move my hand. My knees were dissolved in water. I could take no further step." "That's true, Father. So was I when I came here. And what is not true, son of Nathan," he said, "you will give the children of your truth unending joy and everlasting gladness, and according to the measure of the knowledge, so shall be honored one more than another." The Bakar stared at me. "And that is not true, son of Nathan?" he said. "No, Father, not now. Not while foreign barbarians hold the high priest's robes. Not while we have to risk our lives to keep them from defiling the temple, from setting up their Gilulium, their filth, their idols, in the very holy of holies. Not while there is neither joy nor gladness in the land of Israel, not while we groan under the yoke of the Kittim, the Romans. Not the Macabre lifted his hand. "It will come," he said. "They will be overthrown. The Mashiach will overthrow them when he comes." I stood up and snarled at him. "Much good that will do you or me or any man here. For before your hypocritical Messiah comes, our great-grandchildren will be dead." He shook his head. "That depends upon you, son Nathan," he said quietly, "and upon me, and upon every man born of Abraham. For the day we achieve piety, truth, purity, that day will be the Mashiach come." "Then, Father," I said bitterly, "he will never come." The people made an outcry against me then, but their leader, the Mabakar, silenced them. "Go you, my son," he said quietly. "Walk by the lakeside. Pray. Ask that a sign be given you. Then come to me, and I will interpret God's will for you. It may be that he means for you to return to the world. Perhaps your work lies there. I'd hope, because your knowledge is great, and your mind keen, that you might be granted wisdom, become one of us. But God's will, not ours, be done. Go you now. Meditate. Pray. Then come to me with your decision. May it also be God's." I bowed to him again, whispered, "I thank you, my father," and turning, started down to the shore. I saw the boatmen with their boats drawn up along the shore. I started to turn away from them because all you could fish in the Dead Sea were the black masses of bitumen that came floating to the surface, and were so sticky that the boatmen cleaned their boats of the clinging tarry mess with jars of the menstrual blood of their wives and daughters, which they saved for this purpose, claiming that nothing else would dissolve it. Ew. And although I've never been especially squeamish about the body's natural functions, the process wasn't a thing any man should relish watching. But today I saw that the tar-gatherers were standing together in a group, talking to one another with some excitement, while the black lumps of bitumen melted unnoticed in their craft under the blazing sun, despite the fact that it was winter now, for the Dead Sea knows no season. I went towards them, a curious, anticipatory emotion prickling along my spine, but they noticed my robe's cut and whiteness and fell silent. They had a vast respect for the Essenes. From the way they looked at me, you'd have thought that I was the Morah Zadog, the legendary teacher of righteousness himself. "What's happened?" I said to them. "In God's name, good boatman, what?" They bowed to me first, looked at one another. "It's like this, Reverend Father," one of them began. "Speak, man," I said to them. "It's the new procurator. He got here yesterday. He came down to Jerusalem from Caesarea to put the troops up in the holy city for the winter." "So?" I said. "There was nothing new about that. The Roman troops always wintered in Jerusalem." "He brought the bust of the Roman emperor with him," the boatman said, his voice becoming hoarse with horror, "and all the signa of the legions, slipped them into the city by night. When the people woke up this morning, they were there." I hung there. What blazed through my veins was a great and terrible joy. I had to go home now. I had to, for surely all Jerusalem was flaming with rebellion. Then I hesitated. What the tar fishermen had told me made no sense. The procurators knew our stern prohibition against the display of graven images in the holy city, and always, up until now, they had respected it. What manner of man was this new procurator? A madman, surely. What did he hope to gain by forcing the whole nation into revolt? "Surely you're mistaken, boatman," I said. "The procurators are charged by the imperator himself to respect our customs." "Only this one's different, Reverend Father," the boatman said, kind of cocksure. "Seems he's married to Caesar's own daughter, and—" "But that's impossible," I began. "Caesar has no—" Then I stopped. I had been about to say that Tiberius had no daughters, which was true. But he did have 2 stepdaughters, both presented to him without carnal labor on his part by the divine Julia, daughter of Augustus. Agrippina, whom Julia had had by her first husband, Agrippa, and Claudia, by God knows whom. The little Claudia, who, even before I'd left Rome, the gossips were saying was going to marry. "His name, boatman?" I said. "The new procurator. What's he called?" The spokesman turned to another tar fisher, surely who had brought the news. "What's his name, Jonas? What's the new Roman Epitropus called?" The man thought. "Pilatus. Lucius Pontius Pilatus," he said. Half an hour later, it was all done. I had taken leave of the new Covenanters as respectfully as the circumstances and the furious excitement leaping and blazing in me would allow. I procured a fast horse, paying for the beast the double of its usual hire, and now dressed in my own rich dark clothes, for the first time in more than a year, I pounded towards Jerusalem. As I rode toward the holy city, words sang and leaped through my head. I will render vengeance to mine adversaries, and will recompense them that hate me. I will make mine arrows drunk with blood, and my sword shall devour flesh, with the blood of the slain and the captives, from the head of the leaders of the enemy. Pilatus, of course, he had taken no part in the outrage against Helvetia, but he was of that desolate band, and in any event he was a Roman. Silently I blessed him for his thick-skinned arrogance. He had given me something to live for at last. Vengeance! Which was, it seemed to me then, an honorable motive for continuing an existence that lacked all else. I came up to Jerusalem by the Jericho road, entered the holy city by Herod's gate. An elementary decree of prudence would have caused me to turn southward, once reaching the Mount of Olives, swing halfway around the city, and come into it by the Dung Gate, thus avoiding all danger of running into the Romans. But I remember Joseph Arimathea had said that Helvetia's father would probably go back to Rome with the retiring procurator, Valerius Gratus, which meant that he was surely halfway to Rome by now, and since no other Roman had any personal reason, not that they needed reasons, not that they wouldn't murder a Jew for the mere sport of it, to kill me, that danger was greatly lessened. Besides, there was a hard recklessness in me that panted after danger, that sought it. I reached my father's house, plunged into it, taking all the stairs, two at a time, entered my bedroom, tore my sword down from the wall, turned. My father was standing there, smiling at me with quiet mockery. "Put that thing down, Nathan," he said. "But father," I roared at him, "we can't let the Romans get away with the obscene blasphemy," my father said. "Of course not, Nathan, but neither can we afford the folly of fighting them with their own weapons. We must use methods that have some chance of defeating them, tactics which, being the barbarians and savages that they are, they don't even understand." "Nor do I, father," I said, "because you, too, are at least a barbarian, if not a savage." "Nathan," my father said, only half in jest, it seemed to me. Now put up that barbaric instrument of utter barbarians and come greet your mother. She'll be delighted to see you. Incidentally, so am I. I must say you're looking well." I remembered my manners and went to him, got to my knees, took my hand, kissed it. He raised me up and kissed both my cheeks, warmly murmured a prayer. I took his arm, and we went in together to the women's quarters. My mother's cries of pure delight could be heard at least in Athens, if not in Rome. When I had disentangled myself at last from her embraces, my father drew me away with the pretext of taking me to the temple to receive the high priest's blessing. I knew he was lying. He couldn't have cared less about the high priest or whether I was blessed or not. One of the advantages of being a Sadducee is that we don't believe in the immortality of the soul or a life after death. Therefore, we wear the yoke of religion lightly. He took me into his scriptorium, sat me down, and called for the servants to bring us fruit, wheaten cakes, wine. "I must say you at least look like a Jew at last," he said smilingly. I did. Did I? I did. In Kubrit Qumran, I'd let both my hair and beard grow long. "But father," I said angrily, "what are we going to do?" "About the Romans?" he mocked me. "What do you propose, Nathan? That we marry, or at least ravish all their daughters? He had a typical Sadducee humor, unfeeling, harsh, and, if I may say so, crude. I snapped. They haven't enough of their women here to go around, and besides, the boot's on the other leg in that gentle sort, father. Wherever they're quartered, they don't leave a virgin over 12 years old unless she's been fleeter than a gazelle. But enough of this banter, my venerable and respected sire. I'd still like to know what's going to be done. All right, he said, and his wonderfully handsome face, would God I'd inherited his looks, became serious. Word has gone out to all the nation, all Judea, Transjordania, Perea, Idumea, and Decapolis, Galantis, Iturea, Britannia, Galilee, that every able-bodied man, priests and laymen alike, of whatever persuasion, Essene, Pharisee, us. Go on, I said, shall march at dawn tomorrow upon Caesarea. Good, I said. Unarmed, my father said. By Gehenna, I bellowed. By Sheol, that's folly, father. The Romans would sweep a poorly armed, untrained Jewish rabble into the sea, dye it red with their blood, my father said. But a crowd of men, without even staffs, they'll dare not touch. Remember, the procurator has to justify himself to Caesar, and more immediately to the governor of Syria, who, I've been told, is a most temperate man. Vitellius? I said. He is, but Pilatus isn't. Unfortunately. I happen to know him well. In Rome, he considered himself a friend of mine. What's he like? My father said. An unmitigated swine, an utter scoundrel, a mocker, hard, reckless, without scruples. You know how he came to power? By marrying the divine daughter of the divine Julia. My father shook his head. You have to clarify, son, he said. I know nothing of Roman lineage, divine or not. All right, Julia is the daughter of Caesar Augustus. She was married twice before Augustus pushed her off upon the present occupant of the throne, Tiberius. But long before our great Caesar reached the rulership of the world, Julia had adorned his forehead with the assistance of every slave scum in Rome. This said, she used even the blacks of his Numidian guard. He bore it with his resignation, not daring to offend his august father-in-law. But someone brought the matter to Augustus's attention, and whatever may be said of Augustus, no man can label him unjust. He exiled his own daughter because of her flagrant immorality offended him. And, while in exile, Julia bore a bastard daughter, Claudia, to a Roman knight. The child was brought back to Rome and made a part of Tiberius's household. When, at 55 years of age, our present imperator reached at last the pinnacle of his ambitions. Claudia was 16 when Pilatus saw her, and by then her virginity was not even a memory to her. You've a cruel tongue, my father sighed, but a truthful one. Anyhow, this swart, lean and hungry Iberian, Lucius Pontius Pilatus, saw the divine Claudia. And what cared he if she made the beast with even the stone statues in the imperial gardens? She was the road to greatness. He asked her hand, and Tiberius, only too glad to be rid of this wild duplicate of Julia, gave his consent. So, overnight, a penniless, unknown Spaniard becomes procurator of Judea. And what's worse, one who feels himself supported by his connection to the imperial family, however indirect that connection is, father. We've got to rid ourselves of him? Of course, but by subtle methods, my son. Well, will you march with us tomorrow, unarmed? I thought about that, but I had seen the legions at their exercises and in the games. I knew what a cohort, no, even a century, could do against an untrained mob. The Roman legions were the closest thing to an invincible force the world had ever seen. My father was right. To try to fight them was suicidal folly. Yes, Father, I'll march, I said.